So welcome everybody to this breakfast briefing. As Abdullah and Sarah have already said, I've worked in senior leadership within Children's for a few years now. My journey really has been one of improvement and transformation, innovation and creativity. And so on the topic of early intervention and prevention, it's something I'm particularly excited about. It's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, working on, and just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you this morning. We're going to cover alternatives to care approach. That includes the no wrong door approach, family help, and combining early help and social care and the merits and kind of how I've approached it, and then building a stable and engaged workforce. Because for me, you can't ensure that you're working effectively in the early intervention and particularly prevention space if you haven't got a stable workforce. It makes it much more challenging. I will cover each topic and then we'll stop for Q&A because you just don't want to listen to me talking for the next however many minutes. So I'll stop in between each one for people to ask questions, and there'll be a bit of time to ask questions at the end as well. So this is very high level, bear with me, there's not a lot of detail because I could be here all day, all days, talking about each topic. So I'm just going to talk about some kind of key elements for me, and then thinking about alternatives to care approach, which is an approach I designed quite a few years ago now. But it's all about redirecting the resources we might spend to protect children in a way of reducing risk and supporting families to stay together. It also is, for me, transforming practice because it's about changing how social workers think about how they approach a family and maybe challenging kind of the traditional routes towards safeguarding children that we might have done a few years ago. It also sits really well with family help. So it's a useful way of thinking about things. The full approach really is about front-loading assessment and intervention. And so by that, I mean looking at how much you'd spend maybe protecting children, maybe intervening a bit sooner, and almost throwing the kitchen sink at them. That's probably the way I describe it. So, for example, if you think about a family with 3 children, one may need residential care if they came into care, they've got significant behavioural difficulties, additional needs. 2 other children, you could be spending upwards of 150 to 200,000 per year looking after them. And if you think particularly about those children that would likely end up with a plan of long-term care rather than being able to reunify with family or support them to move to carers within their network, that's a huge amount of money. And the reason the alternatives to care approach works so well is it enables you to spend the money you would have spent on looking after those children on supporting those children at home, making sure they're safe. Safety is always paramount. And you're still not losing money as a local authority because you're not looking after them. So all that money you would spend looking after them, you can redivert to the family. It uses a number of different approaches, and I would say it's really important to think about that structure and network of support services that social workers and others have around them and utilising those to the best effect. So, for example, the benefits of using short breaks, not just short breaks for children with disability. In Norfolk, we also had short breaks for adolescents, and that was surprisingly effective in maintaining safety at home and supporting children to remain with their family. There are other specialist services. So, for example, one that I use for Stronger Families, which is child welfare functional family therapy. Very effective model in reducing risk, as well as supporting families to work together differently and to communicate differently. But it's got a particular focus on reducing risk and supporting safety at home. There's things such as intensive community assessment. You may have heard of it termed as reverse residential. That's actually copyrighted by a lovely support organisation who works alongside children's services across the country. So intensive community assessment is a better way of describing it. And that can be really effective, actually, because we know that for many parents, the risks are not kind of inherent risks that happen in isolation when they're with their children. For many, it's community risks and environmental risks that give us the most concern. So whether that's substance misuse, whether that's spending time with unsafe adults, lots of traffic to the family home, involved with maybe unsafe parents or others in the community. Assessing parenting within the community but safely, because you are using that principle of intensive community assessment, is really key and a really different way of approaching it. But I'd also encourage intensive family support. And our natural instinct is to get children out when there are risks, but sometimes parents can make changes, but we just need to make sure that there's safety while those changes are taking effect or while we're offering the interventions that we need to. So I'd encourage people to think about intensive family support at times. It's not cheap, it is eye-watering, but it's still a lot cheaper than care. And it makes sure that families can remain together, and supports the children to be safe whilst you put in other interventions and do that front loading that I've talked about to ensure that we can, find a new way forward, and effect change within the family. Family networking. Now, this one is it's a model that's been around for some time, but for me, it's a really critical model in that alternative to care approach. And actually, stable homes built on love and the whole focus on kinship really reflects family networking at its absolute best. So for me, it's about finding the key people within that child's network who's safe, who can provide safety, who can provide support, who can provide a listening ear, who is there in order to support the children to feel safe and secure and heard and help them to thrive. But it's also about who is there within a family's network to support the adults. So if you've got a mum who's struggling with neglect, for example, have we got family members or others within her network who can come in and support her to maintain home conditions, to help her to build a different routine? Have we got people who can keep an eye and who feel safe and able to challenge when she's having a difficult time? So that role of family networking, that impact of kinship more widely for children is significant. And it means you can look at places of safety. So could that child, for example, spend a couple of nights with a family member or somebody within their network to kind of give them respite from the situation, or to give parents respite if there are other challenges going on within the household? So I can't emphasize enough that the benefits of family networking, and I'm sure everybody in this room is fully aware of how important that is, but it's a really cost-effective way of supporting children, and a successful way of sustaining positive change if you're able to affect it with the family. Another thing that we really learned, and this was in the context of huge struggles with recruiting geographically, and because of the current climate nationally, we know there are not enough social workers. We know there are challenges in finding good quality permanent social workers to build our teams. We started to look much more closely at the role of alternatively qualified professionals. We've all heard the language, not social work qualified or not qualified workers, but I think we took a different approach and recognised there were lots of people out there with lots to bring to families. They may not have a social work qualification, but they've got multiple other attributes, skills, experience, qualifications, learning that they can bring to supporting families. Equally, they're easier to recruit because it's a much bigger pool of people, much bigger pool of professionals to explore, and dare I say, cost effective, because you're not linking it particularly to the statutory functions. And what we found is that social workers can manage a slightly higher caseload when you are struggling to recruit without feeling like they're drowning if they've got the right professionals around them, that team around the practitioner, as well as the team around the family. And that's hugely beneficial. It's also beneficial to families. We know how some families feel about the word social worker, and we know that they find that difficult. They don't trust us. They feel very strongly that social workers are not going to be able to engage with them, and so that becomes a real barrier to forming that positive relationship, because everything we do is relationship based. What we found is that those who are alternatively qualified, they might have a youth work qualification or an early years qualification. They have a different approach, and they are more able sometimes to build that trusting relationship, and families are more accepting because they're not social workers. I'll talk a bit more, as I said, about the no wrong door approach, but it's a really beneficial way of working with adolescents. We all know and have seen the national trend of the older young people coming into care. We know their outcomes are the very worst, because coming into care late means that we've got very little time to support them to find stability and to re-engage with education, or to kind of develop further. And the no wrong door approach is really built on that foundation of alternatively qualified professionals providing really effective support to families and a really effective intervention. For example, residential practitioners have a wealth of parenting experience, and probably parenting experience for young people who are the most challenging to look after, as we know how things feel in children's homes. So we wanted to utilise that differently. So I'll come on and talk about that a bit more. The alternatives to care approach is also a really effective way of supporting adolescents, whether that's with some intensive family support, whether that be through short breaks, whether it be through no wrong door approach, or something else entirely. Actually, what we found is an alternatives to care approach was also really effective when managing extrafamilial harm and exploitation, not just dealing with those familial challenges, and really effective when you're dealing with family breakdown. So I would very much encourage that alternatives to care approach for families where adolescents are likely to escalate quickly into care. And what I would say is that front loading of resources isn't just for the children, it's also for parents. So I think we all have those challenges where people are too adult focused, and that's not what I'm a proponent of. But if you want to affect change in a household, you have to look at everybody within that relationship and everybody within that household. So you might front load and pay for therapy, for example, for a parent. You might support them to go to a gym. You might support them to engage with a family group. That's what really we're talking about. And I think that if you can help parents to overcome some of their challenges, whatever they may be, particularly with adolescents, it's a really effective way of helping adolescents to remain at home and within their community, most importantly. I think the other thing to say is that it's a really effective way to build positive outcomes for children and families and for the workforce and finances. I saw a workforce who re-engaged with social work. They felt like they were actually doing what they trained to do. I think it's easy in the current climate for social workers to feel like they're case managers, that they just deal day in, day out with safeguarding concerns and don't feel very effective within that. But this different approach where we are balancing the strengths of a family with the things that need to change, and finding a whole host of ways to support families to effect change if we can, it really makes a difference. I think bringing that mix of alternatively qualified staff and social workers together is also really effective, and helps our social workers to feel much more supported and held when they're dealing with those kind of risky cases that they have on their caseload. And I think that it's a really helpful way to support families to just shift in a different direction. And it's also a way of us helping them to build a network, because I know that there are those families, and we see it again and again, sadly, particularly in repeat removals. Families that don't have a network, they don't have that natural support around them, they don't have engagement with family members, particularly if the parents care leavers themselves. So the other thing that I would encourage is being creative and innovative in the interventions that we supply, so that actually families are able to start building networks. For example, one thing that we did, we started to deliver circle of security in a group setting rather than one-to-one, brought families together, really not natural friends in the community, and all dealing with difficult challenges, and challenges that we were presenting to them about their parenting. But they built really firm friendships within that group. They talked to each other, they learned from each other, they struggled together. And actually, we started to build a natural network for families, where they really helped and supported each other, and encouraged each other to keep going when things were feeling difficult and challenging. And we saw real merit in that. We saw a kind of almost a collective within those networks wanting to reduce risk and to keep hold of their children and to kind of move forward as families that are thriving. So I'd highly recommend that. So just to talk very briefly then about No Wrong Door, key principles as well. One of the key elements of No Wrong Door, and for those who don't know what No Wrong Door is, it's a North Yorkshire model. They started the whole approach, and they implemented it within their authority, and then the DfE went out to other authorities who were interested, and we were fortunate enough to be one of those authorities when I was working in Norfolk. So the no heads on beds is a strange thing to say, but essentially you have a children's home, you've got those emergency beds if you need them, but those residential workers are much better placed going out into the community, working with parents, working with young people to bring about change, to build relationships, to help families to think in a different way and to have a different perspective. Also to give parents great strategies to manage challenging behaviour, help families and particularly again parents to manage, child has just, I don't know, smashed up their room, for example. That's not an uncommon experience for adolescents. It's not an uncommon experience in a children's home. Helping parents to take that breath, to not react, and to try and find the strengths and benefits of their children, even when they're going through difficult times. It really builds long-term relationships that are really effective in helping families to de-escalate. But those long-term relationships are not about just about families. It's also about the workers building long-term relationships with those families. They may not need intensive support or regular support for very long, but they're at the end of a phone. They're available to families longer term. And then also, that you have got that respite of a bed if you need it. That said, we all know that once adolescents escalate into care, it's really, really hard to get them home again, because parents suddenly go, oh, it's quiet and calm and it's restful when they're not here. So getting them home again can be much more tricky. So I would really encourage with the no wrong door approach, and it's really effective in providing respite for parents and for young people, but not necessarily overnight. So, for example, they can come to the hub, young people can come to the hub and take part in activities. We can take them out for the day. We can do things with young people that just give them a breather and a space to think and reflect that's away from home. Equally, we can do the same with parents, and parents can come into the hub and engage and again work together, build that network where parents support each other. It's a really, really beneficial environment that allows parents and people to be heard. The no wrong door approach very, very much works with other services within local authority and other agencies, and particularly when addressing contextual safeguarding. You will find by nature that when you have a service that works with adolescents, you'll receive referrals for a lot of young people involved in exploitation or on the cusp of, and we can see the warning signs. If we don't get in there quick, they're likely to then end up in that situation. So it's really effective way of working together. And the no wrong door approach and principle, it automatically and naturally brings agencies together regularly to review what's going on, understand and map exactly what life looks like for that young person, and think about different ways of approaching it. So really effective for safeguarding young people and preventing escalation into care, but also really effective for contextual safeguarding. Another key principle around those building of networks is utilising a wide range of expertise, including foster carers, police, speech and language therapy, psychology, to name a few. So, for example, we know that a young person that is really struggling is likely to struggle with their emotional vocabulary. That's why we see the aggressive outbursts at times, or the high distress and dysregulation that we might see from young people. And so working with a speech and language therapist can help to give them an emotional vocabulary and help them to find different ways of expressing themselves and more effective ways of being heard. And it's the most amazing thing to watch that kind of transformation. It's a really worthwhile approach. With the no wrong door model, you'll have police liaison officers based within the hub. That's really important. It helps with mapping, with understanding what's going on. Again, particularly effective with exploitation risk, but useful in many different ways when we bring people who are struggling. Foster carers, every no wrong door hub has foster carers attached. They are part of that community hub within the no wrong door model, but they also engage really well with young people. So they might be part of those daily activities. They'll be building relationships with young people. And what's really lovely about that is if a young person does escalate into care, rather than them sitting in an emergency unit before we find another residential unit, maybe hundreds of miles from home, those foster carers already have a relationship with the young person, and we are likely to be able to place an adolescent into a foster placement as opposed to residential, giving them much better opportunities, better outcomes, obviously cost effective for the local authority, but also much better chance of us being able to rehabilitate them home at some point in the future because they're used to a family environment. I think the other thing I would say is that although the No Wrong Doors model is specifically aimed at adolescents, it kind of in the mainstream education system, it does work with SEND too. I think because of some of the benefits that are brought, such as the psychology and the speech and language therapy, because many times young people with SEND, even quite profound additional needs, it can be adolescents first. And what we're seeing isn't a manifestation of their additional need, it's a manifestation of them being an adolescent. The no wrong door model can work really well for SEND, not just for children within the mainstream system. And then the final thing I would say about the no wrong door approach, and it is absolutely central, is a provocation of, would this be good enough for my child? And every practitioner involved in No Wrong Door at every level continually asks ourselves that question and thinks about the best way to approach it. And that helps us to remain in a strengths and needs focus rather than a risk and behavioural focus. And it helps us to work with others in that ilk. So then moving on, and forgive me for going at a pace, but we haven't got a lot of time this morning. So outcomes that we tend to see, and I've talked about some of those already. Obviously, the primary positive outcome is that child or young person gets to remain within their family, and if not their family, their community. And we know how essential that is for positive outcomes. And the key focus with the alternatives to care approach is that we see risk reducing, and healing beginning. And I think that second element is just as important as risk reducing. Parents really struggle to forgive their children when children have told professionals what's going on at home. Children, obviously, and quite rightly, struggle to forgive their parents when they've experienced abuse or neglect. And so the whole focus with that alternatives to care approach is not just the kind of practical physical safety, it's also that psychological safety that comes with families engaging differently, parents who have empathy for their children, and children who love their parents and feel safe with their parents. So that's really the central focus. We see the network much more involved for children, and that makes such a difference to them and to parents as well. Parents no longer feel alone, they no longer feel this sense of, well, that strong sense of guilt and shame that we know can perpetuate the cycle of abuse or neglect. And we see children beginning to thrive, not just in school, but in life, and re-engaging with their life and with their education. Obviously, we see reducing needs, not just for children, also for parents, and reducing the likelihood of ongoing state intervention, which is far better for families and obviously helps us too. But what I would say is there are some families where they will struggle until the children are adults. And this way of working enables us to be effective in that space, intervening when we need to, pulling back when we can, intervening when we need to. So you don't get that perpetuating cycle of kind of cumulative neglect that you might otherwise see. And parents feel empowered and heard. I think that is absolutely key to the alternatives to care model. For the local authority, there are significant financial savings and fewer children coming into care, which is an absolute win-win because that means we can meet the needs of those who are in our care more effectively. And it also means that financially we're delivering value for money for our residents. And it helps us to use resources more effectively because we know exactly what we need to do. We can develop a whole host of interventions, and it just makes it more effective, but also easier to budget and plot. You know where you're going on your sort of 1 year, 3 year, 5 year process. That's really important. Costs can be front loaded, and that's the only thing that I would say. However, what you tend to see is they reduce month on month, year on year, because we see fewer families escalating, we see fewer families coming back. And so it becomes really cost effective, and you can really track those savings in an effective way. So when we're going into those budget challenge sessions, we know exactly what's what. And as I said before, you see a really engaged workforce who feel like they're doing what they would term proper social work. And there's nothing quite like seeing that ethos and that culture running through services. Partnership agencies will also see a benefit because they will often see a reduction in demand over time. So if we've met people's mental health needs, or if we've given them therapy, they're less likely to need mental health services, for example. Maybe we see young people, particularly through No Wrong Door, their missing episodes significantly reduce. That helps our police colleagues. So it's a really effective way of working, and partners are included at all steps, and they become part of the safety planning, which is really beneficial to the family, but also helps our partners to feel like they know exactly what's going on. Challenges. Identifying the right families, always a challenge. However you apply criteria or referral processes, it's always going to be tricky. So I would say that this does require some senior oversight, so that you can make sure that you're reacting quickly and effectively when you need to with timely intervention, but so that you can make sure you're reaching the right families. I have seen people apply alternatives to care to families we know are going to escalate into the legal process, to give them the evidence they need to go into the legal process. That's not the ethos of the alternatives to care approach. Whilst really tempting, this really is for those families where you feel like there's a chance of risk reducing and families remaining together. Managing that flow of resources can be tricky. We've all had those months where, for whatever reason, 10 babies are born in a month, or sometimes in a week, and you've got to figure out which families to approach with this way of working, and what else you might do. There are financial implications if the risk continues to escalate. But what I would say is, if you work on the principle of, if they're not in care this month, this is how much we saved. If they're not in care this month, this is how much we saved. You're still, and you can use that money that you've saved to front load to the family. You're never going to spend as much as you'd save, so it still produces savings and cost effectiveness, but you might see some financial challenges. I would say be really careful when you're forecasting and budget setting. Really think about where you want to reflect those savings and how you want to approach that. Sourcing the right stuff and the right services can be tricky, and I think we all know, particularly in the current climate, agencies are very, very busy, so we need to make sure that we're thinking about what services we've got And do we want to commission those services? Do we want in-house services? Each come with their own challenges and benefits. So that's something else to think about. But whole system buy-in with the partnership, that's also a key area that I would just give some caution to. I think it's really important to engage partnership early. We know that they will see day to day, particularly our education colleagues, the impact on the child. So we need their buy-in so that they can work with us and they feel safe in the approach with us, and so that they're involved in that safety planning. And I think that, as I said earlier, sometimes the building or finding that wider network, that family network, can be challenging. So I'd encourage people to think about professionals as well, but professionals who are going to be in that family's life longer term. Who else can we source as part of a network that we can pull together to support the family? And then, as I said earlier, building trust and positive relationships can at times be really challenging, particularly for families who've been previously involved with services that maybe weren't working in this way. I have seen families be really, really concerned by the alternatives to care approach, and with views of, you're just trying to catch us out, you just want my children, and you're just finding new and creative ways to do that. So that can be difficult sometimes. So talking about family help specifically, I was really fortunate in Norfolk to implement family help ahead of the DFE waves. We did apply for wave 2, but we were already too far on. And so last summer already? Nope, sorry, summer 23, we implemented a pilot of family help within Norfolk. And we actually took the decision to bring together our early help teams, our social work teams, and we put them together into one big team with some of our alternatively qualified workers as well. So then we had social work managers working across all the practitioners working with a family. It's a really effective way of getting in there early and making sure you've got timely intervention, and it makes it a really seamless way of working. So, for example, a referral will come through, it's unclear whether there's any risk. It would likely go through to early help services in the past, sorry. Within the family help model, yes, the family worker from early help service might go out, that family practitioner might go out in the first instance to complete the initial visit, assessment, but then the whole team comes together and talks about it and decides a plan moving forwards. So it enables us to have social workers and alternatively qualified staff working together routinely, regularly for the family. And it's a really effective way of identifying risks and strengths at a really early stage. It allows for that seamless movement. So what I mean by that is, you might have a family practitioner working with that family initially, but if risks escalate, they may get support from a social worker within the team, or it may transfer to a social worker within the team. But for the family, it's one team, it's one assessment that is ongoing, and it's one plan. And I think that's really critical for the family, that they have one plan regardless of what level of support they need. And for the workers, they feel safe, they feel able to assess robustly and effectively because they've got the input of a family practitioner, of a social worker, maybe a specialist domestic abuse worker, if that's relevant to the case, or somebody who focuses on emotional well-being, or somebody who's a specialist in parenting approaches. And so that kind of bringing together of different perspectives enables the family to seamlessly move from one to the other without having to retell their story, without having to be reassessed multiple times. We all know those families that step up, step down, step up, step down. And I think for them, they hate this constant change of team, change of personnel, having to repeat their stories. We also see risks and worries being missed because it gets lost in translation, or if something's not recorded in an assessment, the new worker doesn't necessarily know about it. And it also helps the family if you're looking at if you've got an unstable workforce, because it stays within that team. They have that connect and that team around the sort of family approach. And I think it's a really effective approach where you've got almost like a work family working with the actual family to support and effect change. I've said about the role of commission services because this is one key area, I think, for family help. Because you've got all your workers working within one team, there may be times where you need a commission service to come in and support and effectively access that. And I think what we used to do is, well, it's only if they're about to come into care that we'll let them have that service. But with the family help way of working, actually, you might allow that commission service to work with the family sooner because, James said it earlier, we know, we can see that if we get in there early, we can support families to stay together, and reduce the risk at a very early stage or stop there from ever being risk. So it's a really different approach from your kind of traditional approach that we see within children's services. I think that the other thing I would say is it gives really effective safety planning because you have all the professionals within that team thinking together about what's safe for the family and thinking with the family and the family network about whether it's safe. And although I haven't included it in this section, I think the kinship element, and the creativity, that comes with family networks, that really sits well alongside family help. That safety from the network, and actually, the new kinship approach is very exciting because it gives us a really clear way, a really clear strategy to support families with their own network, with their own system. What I would say with family help, and I'm not going into loads of detail because I think lots of people now have seen the details around what family help should do. So that's why I'm not going into lots of detail about exactly our structure in Norfolk. But what I did learn with the pilot, so we started the pilot summer 2023. It was with a third of our localities. So it was a big group of staff, and it was a challenge trying to balance resources. But to be fair, I think the biggest challenge was figuring out the right way to do it. With change, with transformation, particularly where it involves significant system and practice change, such as family help, you can go one of two ways. You can go the test and learn approach or a leadership design approach, and then roll it through to implementation. And I would say that the test and learn approach is the one that we chose. It was really exciting and fabulous to do it that way. Some of our staff were not convinced and did not like the test and learn approach. I had many staff saying to me, just tell us what you want us to do and we'll do it. We really don't like this uncertainty. We don't know where our boundaries are. We don't know what we can and can't do. It feels a bit unsafe. We had others who loved it. Some of our team managers really embraced the test and learn approach and loved the autonomy that this gave them. And I think that's a key feature of family help. It gives our team managers and our practitioners more autonomy, and it keeps the decision making where it should be. There's always a space for senior decision making and that impartial, reflective perspective that you get from another layer of governance. But I would say that the people who know the families best are those that know them and that work with them, and they know best what those families need 9 times out of 10. And so that's the joy of redesigning the service with your team managers and your frontline staff, and that is also the joy of the family help model once it's up and running. The other thing I would say about family help, it's very much at the moment focused on social work and early help. But I think it can be applied to special educational need and disability alongside children with disability services. To something else to think about. For example, you could have a CWD expert within your family help team and not have separate services, but have mainstream services that are integrated. You could put an AHC coordinator and reviewer into that team, or you can create family help approach, but with SEND. So early support when children are showing signs of additional needs, moving all the way through to EHC, and disability services. Just something else to hold in mind. In terms of outcomes, I think that so we evaluated our family help pilot. We brought in research and practice because we had two problems we wanted to solve. One was for families and them having a better experience. Quality of our practice wasn't bad actually, and outcomes were positive, but they had a difficult experience with handoffs and changes of worker, and that's something we really wanted to change. And we also wanted to support our staff, which is why talking about engaged and stable workforce, we wanted our staff to feel like it worked for them. We had a lot of social workers that were very newly qualified because we found we had to grow our own, and they've really struggled with holding statutory work. They felt very, very isolated, at times frightened and worried. And this family help approach where they had colleagues around them and that reflective space built into their day made such a big difference for them. So for children and families, I would say predominantly one plan. That was really monumental for families. And I think it's all of our holy grail. It's something we've all talked about, allowing children to be children, having one child's plan that involves all partnership perspectives and interventions, including YJS. Really helpful for the family and for staff, actually. It's a much, much better way of approaching things. And I think family help gives you much better opportunity of achieving it. As I've already said, families don't have to repeat their story and be reassessed. not just with changes in team, but also when risk changes, it's seamless because you've already got that team working around them. It really does promote positive relationship because the family build a relationship with the team, and that really changes their view. Best feedback I had from the evaluation from families was I felt heard. I thought my social worker knew what they were doing. It was really nice that I didn't have to keep telling the story again and again. Some really important feedback. And what we found, and we weren't necessarily expecting this from Family Help, but we started to find that absent parents, particularly absent dads, were being much more considered just naturally, because there was always somebody in the group who'd say, what about dad? What about grandparents? What about that other family member? So it really helps with that as well. And I think it really does enable that whole system working. For the local authority, you are looking at resources being used much more effectively because you've got much more robust assessment of strengths and needs. You've got that workforce stability because staff are feeling more engaged and reducing that pressure on social workers particularly, but actually watching early help practitioners, social workers, alternative qualified workers, all learning from each other and all respecting each other. That was a joy. And it helped us to move away from that social worker focused perspective more onto a practitioner perspective, which is much more helpful for families. It's a really cost effective model because you've got built in support at every level. The team really can do almost all of it. You only need one management stream and one level of oversight. So it can be incredibly cost effective. And just bringing two services into one makes a big difference. And over time, partners were really clear that they preferred this way of working. And that was really helpful to us. We continually struggled to keep partners informed just through the nature of our systems and some of the challenges within the system. And so partners really appreciated this perspective and they felt better. I think particularly when they were seeing risks on the cusp of social work, frustrated it was sitting in early help maybe, actually they started to see the merit of this way of working. Again, it's identifying families at the right families to work at the right level can be a challenge. It's something to hold in mind. It's not necessarily a problem, and it's not something that we experience great difficulties with, but definitely something to hold in mind. And supporting staff to change their way of working, tricky to say the least, and it took some time. And I think the most heartbreaking thing was hearing some practitioners still saying, well, I'm just not as important as others, they should get the resources first. And so it really is, it's not just a practice change, it's a culture shift and a different perspective. We're all in it together. Partnership engagement and support is a really key challenge that we maybe, well, I know I could have done better with in Norfolk. I've definitely engaged leaders within the partnership quite effectively at the beginning as a pilot. But that tricky thing of how do you get things down to the front line from leaders is always the difficulty. So that if I had my time again with the pilot would be what I did differently. I would bring frontline practitioners from all agencies together really early on and start that engagement and spreading the word, because I think that would have made a really helpful difference right at the beginning. I think the other challenge is financial climate, and balancing effective early help with core statutory services. My observation and reflection would be that Family Help really helps with that. I think, James, again, going back to your question earlier, by using Family Help and bringing everybody together in one team, it's a much more cost effective way. Because if all of those children needed a social worker or had to have a social worker, it costs loads more money. And because it's one team and you've reduced costs by bringing two separate services together as one, again, it looks like a really good cost effective proposition for members. So it's a really helpful approach. As I said, test and learn doesn't work for all. Who knew? I love change and I love transformation, but weirdly, not everyone does. So that's definitely something to hold in mind. And that shift in thinking, I think that you can't underestimate that. You need to spend as much time on cultural change within your teams as you do on anything else. And one of the challenges is when risk escalates into child protection arena. I know that the Family Help Built Stable Homes Built on Love, it's focused on a separate safeguarding child protection kind of joint team. We didn't take that approach. We kept our child protection cases within the team, but we installed child protection experts, so managers who specifically focused on child protection to come alongside workers when they were working child protection. Our decision to do that was really because we didn't want to de-skill workers. We'd tried specialist teams before for court work, for child protection, and actually just de-skilled a whole workforce. Equally, social workers burn out really, really fast when all they do all day long is child protection work. So we took the decision to keep it within the main teams, but with that additional support. It's a different way of thinking about things. So, the final piece, building a stable and engaged workforce. We know that if you don't have a stable and engaged workforce, it's really difficult to deliver the services in the ethos and the culture that we would want to deliver them. It requires a really robust recruitment strategy, but also focusing on retention as well. And I think it's a key. It's an area that people often miss, and I used to until I learned how important it was. You get all bells and whistles, singing and dancing, recruitment strategy. Look at us, we're an amazing authority. Come and work for us. They come and work for us, and they go in a year because they're like, well, you're pretty rubbish. You're not what we thought you were. There's no development opportunity. There's no ability to progress. We don't want to be here. So really important to make sure you've got a very clear retention strategy. And again, over time, you can shift funds to retention and away from recruitment as you start to build that stable environment, which is really beneficial. I think a key thing, and I'm going to not necessarily talk about everything because of the time, but I would say that staff need to feel heard, they need to feel valued, respected, and validated. And I think that regardless of what's going on in terms of performance or quality or compliance, it's incredibly important that as leaders at every level, we do this. And I think it's so easy to lose that, particularly if you're on an improvement journey or that there's real struggles with performing within a team. So I think senior leaders need to be really visible, and that doesn't necessarily mean just being in the office, although there is absolutely no substitute for being in the office. But particularly when you're in a large authority, where you just couldn't reach everyone if you tried because of the nature of the geographical area, it's being visible in a multiple ways. So get people to, responding when people have done something well, to say really well done, turning up to meetings and hearing directly from the front line, being available when they need to talk something through, being willing to talk through your decision making at length and reflect and listen. Those are key areas to be visible. And again, you just can't account for that with staff. You need a really clear offer for newly qualified staff. And I think most authorities have that now, but they really are our future. That's how we managed to build a really positive service in Norfolk. And it's also really important that first line managers are engaged, interested, and you invest in their future and their development and training. Because for frontline staff, generally the only way for them to feel really engaged and supported is to have a good manager. We all know the old adage, you can do anything if you've got a good team around you and you feel supported. So that investment in first line management is critical and key, and ongoing investment, not just when they first move into the role, is really important. I think clear policy and strategy on EDI issues is essential. We live in a really diverse community. I love that. I love watching the diverse community that we work with all coming together to support children and families. It's a really exciting way for human beings to interact and to work together. But we know that in some authorities there's less. They're predominantly white, and that can be really challenging for staff who are not. We know that staff can experience racism from families that they work with, but we also know that they can experience racism on a day-to-day basis from their colleagues and partner agencies. So I would strongly urge that people have a really good strategy for EDI. Similar for disability, very important to think about disabled workers. Where are your hard lines? What can you do to support them? What can't you? It's essential. Everybody is different, everybody has a unique set of needs, and again, if your first line manager is interested and engaged with their staff, they will know exactly what's going on for that individual and will support that individual, but they need the framework that we can provide as leaders. Service development should always be a joint approach. Performance addressment, when you're addressing poor performance, that should be a joint approach. Work collaboratively with your staff at every point that you can. It makes such a huge difference and helps them to feel heard and validated. And that high support and high challenge culture, for me, that's critical. There is no point setting really high expectations for staff, and I tend to. It's for children, so I have high expectations and clear vision. But what's the point if I don't give staff the tools and the support they need in order to deliver what I'm asking them to deliver? So that is also really key and really critical. Good governance structures where staff feel held, supported and safe, but also with swift decision making when they need it is another key ingredient. And making sure that children's outcomes are not cost is a focus, I would say, is also really important, particularly when we're talking about decision making for family safety. yes, we need to think about cost. The frontline do not. We need them to think about what the family needs, and then we can work from there. And being honest with staff, also essential. I think, it's really important for leaders to be human. You've got a much better chance of reaching your staff and engaging with them if they can see that humanity and that honesty, and transparency. It's absolutely key. And the last one's a bit controversial in treating agency and permanent workers the same. But for me, what I learned over time is if you want everyone to work in the same way, to the same level, to the same quality, the same input, you've got to train them all, and you need to support them all to do the same effectively. So I think it's really key. Um, it's challenging, but it's really worthwhile. I'm going to skip over the outcomes because I think we all know what those outcomes would be, and I know that this is going to go out afterwards. So then just talking about the challenges. As I said already, geography and workforce climate makes life more tricky for some than others. For Norfolk it was tricky because half of our county was neighbouring sea. And dolphins and seals, sadly, are not effective child protection workers, I discovered over time. But it's also difficult for landlocked authorities because you've got other authorities just waiting to poach your staff, and vice versa. So it's challenging whichever way around. Previous reputations. If you've not always been a great authority to work for, or you've not always been in a good position with Ofsted, really hard to shake that off, can take years. In your recruitment strategy, really focus on that and a way of how do you address that. You can't just leave it as an elephant in the room because staff won't come. I think the challenge in implementing when staffing is not yet where it should be, that's a really critical one for me. It's that conversation with your workforce. Do they want to take on a bit more and avoid interims maybe within the frontline services? Or do they want interims but a certain amount? How do you want to approach it? So, for example, in Norfolk took a really brave decision within one team to actually not recruit interims because of the way the work was flowing, and staff made the decision to take on a high caseload in the short term with support until we were able to build a more permanent team. And actually that worked really well, but that's where that honesty and that visibility comes into its own, because you can have those conversations with your staff much more effectively. I think it's that investment in first line managers can be tricky. It's expensive sometimes, and maybe not in money, but maybe in time to think about how you might do it. Are you going to seek your leaders to be mentors so they support your first line managers? Are you going to look at something like Frontline? How are you going to do that? And then I think equally, EDI, although I said you must have a policy and strategy, actually figuring out what the best approach is for your local authority, your geographical area, your staff cohort, that can be quite difficult. And addressing and understanding issues and concerns can also be challenging at times. So definitely pause for thought on that one. And then I was just thinking in terms of recruitment, balancing the needs of the different services. I've seen some authorities where they only bring new staff in. Every new permanent worker goes into their safeguarding service because that's where they struggle to maintain stability. But it just means that you then end up with less stability in your corporate parenting service and your children with disability service, so they couldn't take cases. So they ended up with a bottleneck and a backlog. So again, think about where your needs are and make sure your strategy considers all services, not just the one that seems to be having the most difficulties.